Major funding for the series, Louisiana, A History, was provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and the State of Louisiana. Corporate funding was provided by Bank One, proud to celebrate Louisiana's diverse past and committed to investing in our state's future. Community Coffee, part of Louisiana's rich history. Since 1919, devoted to providing signature coffees to our communities. Additional funding was provided by the following history patrons, helping all citizens discover the extraordinary legacy of Louisiana and its people.
Our city at this time presents the most warlike and military appearance. The beat of the drum and heavy tramp of armed men is heard throughout the day and night.
Before the start of the Civil War, Louisiana was a place of enchanting beauty, robust prosperity, and abundant promise. But only for some of its people.
The key reason why young men who weren't from slave-owning families volunteered was they looked forward to a great adventure.
They had no idea what it would actually be like when war came along, what it would entail as far as losing fathers, sons, and brothers in combat.
The two armies devastated Louisiana in their struggle for control of the nation's backbone, the Mississippi River. When it was over, Louisiana had been laid to waste.
I have been completely ruined. My land, the only thing remaining, is totally valueless.
It was the greatest catastrophe Louisiana has ever faced. But it was also a time of legendary courage and impassioned loyalty.
There's something in their makeup that causes them to go forward, sometimes in what many of us would consider hopeless situations, and take horrendous casualties, but still advancing.
And out of the ashes of that terrible war would rise a new Louisiana.
When the Civil War started, some Louisianians could still remember a time when their home first became a part of the United States. But now they were breaking away from the American nation. No one could have foreseen the degree of devastation that the war would bring. When it was over, Louisiana was reconstructed as a part of the United States once again. But the violence, corruption, and social upheaval of that period left scars on the state, some of which remain with us even today.
Every one of us loved that flag. The flag of the United States had been our flag. And yet we felt it must go, and our flag rise in its place.
On January 9th, 1861, a band of Louisianians armed themselves and boarded the steamboat National in New Orleans, then headed north to Baton Rouge. Without firing a shot, they seized the U.S. Army's arsenal there and claimed it for the state of Louisiana. They were acting under the orders of the governor, Thomas Overton Moore.
The safety of the state of Louisiana demands that I take possession of all government property within her limits. With a large force at my disposal, this demand will be enforced. Any attempt at defense on your part will be a rash sacrifice of life.
From public edifices, hotels, and private buildings, the Pelican flag was hoisted and displayed its ample folds to the breeze. The church bells proclaimed the news of secession in vibrating tones, whilst the deep voice of the cannon announced it even more loudly.
Louisiana soon discovered that cannons sound different when fired not in celebration, but at her countrymen. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on the Union's Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Southern forces were led by General Gustav Beauregard, previously an officer in the United States Army from St. Bernard Parish. Shortly afterwards, Beauregard would lead the Confederate forces to victory in the first major battle of the Civil War at Manassas. Louisiana claimed the Confederacy's first war hero. After secession, Louisiana joined with 10 other southern states in forming a new nation, the Confederate States of America. Now that the war had begun, the Confederacy's president, Jefferson Davis, asked Louisiana to furnish several thousand troops for immediate deployment. The state responded generously. At the start of the war, some 24,000 Louisianians volunteered to fight for the South, more than any other state except Virginia.
We are sending the very princes of our land, men of family, men whose loss will be deplored by the whole community.
Louisiana's armies were a reflection of her people, colorful and diverse. Unlike other parts of the South, immigrants made up at least 10% of the state's inhabitants. So along with native-born Louisianians, companies were composed of men from around the world: Irish, Italian, even Slavic soldiers. Perhaps most surprising to some were the many free blacks who volunteered to defend Confederate Louisiana. By 1862, more than 3,000 free men of color had joined the Louisiana militia, known as the Native Guard.
This was their home. They did have affection for it, but it was also their business, their work, people they knew. It was a reaction to what they considered to be a threat to their way of life.
They were slave owners, they were property owners, and I think that in many instances, they operated as you or I would operate, or as anyone would operate, and that is according to your purse or your pocketbook.
But of the thousands of young men who eagerly stepped forward to fight, few were prepared for the horrors that this war would inflict upon them and their homeland.
Although there was this sort of feeling that one Southerner could whip 5 Yankees or 5 Northerners, they had no idea what it would actually be like when war came along, what it would take to sustain the armies in the field, what it would entail as far as losing fathers, sons, and brothers in combat. They just had no clue what a long war was going to be like.
I had my name enrolled with the list of volunteers for service in the Confederate States of America. I am willing to shed the last drop of my blood on the altar of my country, if that could be the means of saving us from Northern treachery.
In the Florida parishes, Camp Moore became the main training ground for Louisiana's soldiers. But fighting off hunger and disease, troops began to worry more about dying in their tents than on the battlefield.
I was astonished by the change. Of the 600 who first arrived, there are now but about 250. Everywhere it's diarrhea, chills, and fever.
Throughout Louisiana, people of every class and color pitched in to help needy soldiers and their families. Before long, however, many at home could no longer help themselves. Immediately after the first shots were fired, President Lincoln ordered the largest blockade ever attempted. Union warships patrolled more than 3,000 miles of coastland in an effort to strangle off Southern commerce, especially at the mouth of the Mississippi River.
Things are daily increasing in price. Coffee is now $1 per pound, and Ma has notified us that we must soon say goodbye to it.
New Orleans, the great economic engine powering the Confederacy, had virtually ground to a halt. By February of 1862, 2,000 families depended on government relief for food. Even more than supplies, however, what New Orleans needed most was soldiers.
The South just did not have enough manpower to defend every point, so you had to have priorities. And in the early days of the war, the main threat was to Tennessee and Virginia, so that's where they were shipping the troops to. There just weren't many men left to defend New Orleans.
It was no military secret that sooner or later the Union would attempt to wrest control of New Orleans from the Confederacy.
From the northern perspective, it was essential to the northern economy. Also militarily for the North, if they can capture the river, it would split the South in two and would lop off the Western Confederacy from the main body of the Confederacy and make it easier to conquer. So the Mississippi River became kind of a focal point for both sides.
Besides its strategic value, New Orleans was also a vital center of cash and supplies for Confederate forces. It was one of the few industrial cities of the South with factories producing weapons, uniforms, and shoes. Rebel leaders believed that the Union would come downriver, attacking from the north, so defenses were concentrated in places like Memphis and Vicksburg.
And while Governor Moore and others in Louisiana were constantly sending out messages to Jefferson Davis begging for men and supplies, Davis felt like the situation there was sufficient to prevent New Orleans from being captured. He was absolutely wrong.
Word reached New Orleans that a fleet of federal warships had been spotted in the Gulf of Mexico. 15,000 Union soldiers were assembling on Tiny Ship Island, just off the coast from Biloxi, and more were on their way. Downriver from New Orleans, the city's defense would depend on two strongholds facing each other from opposite sides of the Mississippi, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip.
They looked good on paper, but they weren't nearly as strong as they appeared to be. They were impregnable-looking fortresses, big, tall brick walls, about 20 feet high, 10 feet thick, moats around them, had over 100 cannons inside the forts and several hundred men. But as it turned out, the cannons were old and outdated. Some of them had actually been used in the War of 1812. The powder had been sitting there for years and turned out to be very bad, very poor quality. The men, a lot of them didn't want to be there.
The officer charged with the unenviable duty of defending New Orleans was Major General Mansfield Lovell.
He was a Northerner by birth. He really stepped into almost an unwinnable situation. He did a good job in trying to raise troops and gather cannons and things to defend New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, but part of the problem was as quickly as he could raise troops, Jefferson Davis was taking them away to send elsewhere.
General Lovell did what he could to fortify the city's defenses. He bolstered the artillery and strengthened the garrisons. A raft, constructed of cypress trees and 2.5-inch chain cables, was stretched across the river to block the passage of enemy ships between the two forts. On April 18, 1862, 46 federal warships steamed up the Mississippi towards Forts Jackson and St. Philip. Armed with 348 cannons and 21 mortars, it was the largest fleet the United States Navy had ever assembled. In command was the 60-year-old flag officer, David Farragut, a Southerner who had spent much of his life in New Orleans. His friends among the rebels had urged him to defect, but he remained loyal to the United States.
Mind what I tell you. You fellows will catch the devil before you get through with this business.
Farragut was a man of his word. Day and night, the Union fleet rained down thousands of shells on the forts for nearly a week. The thunder of the guns was heard 50 miles away. Amazingly, the forts held. But rather than turn around, Farragut opted for one of the most daring maneuvers of the war. At 2 a.m. on April 24th, he signaled a charge upriver.
He was hoping that they could slip past in the dark without being seen. But it didn't work. They were spotted. There was a huge artillery duel, over 100 cannons in the forts, probably at least that many on the ships, for several hours as the fleet battled its way past the forts.
At one point, Farragut found his own ship ablaze with flames leaping halfway up the main mast. Still, he continued his relentless advance.
He had absolutely no guarantee that he would be able to get past those forts with his vessels. He was taking a real chance.
When daylight came, Farragut's fleet had virtually destroyed Confederate defenses on the river. Of all the ships that had tried to run past the forts, only 2 failed to make it. From there, Farragut and his men cruised upriver toward New Orleans unopposed.
The sugar and cotton have been burned. That is one comfort. And the work of destruction still goes on at the plantations. I shall never forget the long, dreadful night when we sat with our friends and watched the flames from all sorts of valuables as the gunboats were coming up the river.
But even if it could not fight off an attack, New Orleans, the South's treasure house, was determined to deny Farragut his prize. To avoid capture, General Lovell pulled his troops out before the fleet arrived, leaving New Orleans defenseless. On Friday afternoon, April 25th, the Union fleet dropped anchor at the foot of Canal Street. With the river running high that spring, Farragut's ships sat well above the levees. They trained their guns straight down on the city. Resistance was pointless. Confident in his victory, Farragut sent just 2 officers, unarmed, into the city.
They walked abreast, unguarded and alone, looking not right or to left, never frowning, never flinching, while the mob screamed in their ears, shook cocked pistols in their faces, cursed and crowded, gnashed upon them. So through the gates of death, those 2 men walked to the city hall to demand the town's surrender. It was one of the bravest deeds I ever saw done.
Farragut had taken New Orleans, but keeping it would be charged to another man. While the admiral and his fleet continued upriver toward Baton Rouge, the Union Army took possession of the city, led by a general who would come to be called the Beast.
Men, women, and children went splashing through the mud together to get first sight. As soon as they saw Butler, every epithet which could be applied to the vilest was heaped upon him.
During the Civil War, few men were as hated as General Benjamin Butler.
And for good reason. He was not a likable man. He was large physically, rather rotund, balding, kind of sad, droopy-eyed. He had one eye that kind of went off to one angle that was kind of disconcerting when you talked to him. Very self-confident, kind of an egomaniac. But he immediately got embroiled in controversies.
Butler ordered the censorship of all New Orleans newspapers. When journalists met with him to protest the decree, one editor asked the unthinkable.
General, what will you do if I just ignore your order and I print what I want to print? And they said Butler turned beet red and jumped up from his table and pounded his fist on the desk, and he said, "Sir, I am Jesus Christ." He said, "He who sins against me sins against the Holy Spirit." And the editor's jaws dropped open at the blasphemy of the man, but that was Butler. To New Orleans, he was God.
Freedom of the press was not the only constitutional right this Union general brushed aside. Butler shut down Episcopal churches throughout New Orleans and banished 3 ministers because they prayed for Confederate officials instead of Abraham Lincoln. Private homes and property were seized, then auctioned off by the general's brother.
New Orleans is a conquered city, and by the law of nations, she lies subject to the will of the conqueror.
Declaring martial law, Butler sought to squash any spirit of Southern patriotism. One man, William Mumford, was executed for holding down an American flag. Another was sentenced to 3 months' hard labor because he had cheered for the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. But nothing earned Benjamin Butler so much hatred as his notorious General Order Number 28.
Hereafter, when any female shall, by word, gesture, or movement, insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and treated as a woman of the town plying her vocation.
That is, as a prostitute. The women of New Orleans would never forgive nor forget General Benjamin Butler.
Butler the Brute will be handed down to posterity as a byword by which all true Southerners will remember thee, the vilest of scum.
The niggers here think that we've come after them and are flocking to us every day to go off with Massa Lincoln. But of course, we do not permit them to harbor around at all.
Free blacks became, as well as slaves, a problem, especially the slaves, because some of the Union generals spent a lot of time returning them to the plantations, trying to force them to continue to produce the sugar cane and produce the crops that was necessary.
Federal refugee camps for the runaways were crowded and unsanitary. Those who did not succumb to disease or hunger were often forced to work in conditions little different from the slavery they had left behind.
The North argued and believed that the Republic could not survive if the losers of an election seceded. And the North talked about preserving the Union. President Lincoln had not wanted to make it a war to end slavery because he didn't think he could maintain the support of Northerners for the war if he did that. There were 4 border states that were slave states that stayed in the Union. Lincoln felt like he could not push to end slavery and keep those in the Union.
But much had changed since the start of the conflict. Union generals knew that without slavery, the Confederacy would crumble. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass continued to push for their cause. So with the stroke of his pen, Abraham Lincoln redefined the meaning of the Civil War. No longer was it a struggle over states' rights or safeguarding the Union. Now, it was a fight to end slavery. Liberty for most slaves became law on New Year's Day, 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect.
Emancipation meant a new birth. Emancipation meant to the blacks a new beginning. To whites, it meant a loss of vast resource and economic investment.
To Lincoln, it meant a shrewd strategic move.
When the Union troops entered a plantation or the region of the plantation South, there was mass exodus of blacks from the plantation. They took mules, utensils. They tried to cripple the war efforts from the Confederate point of view. So they added, as Lincoln said, a kind of another dimension and a secret weapon or a way to hit at the heart of the South.
We was in the road playing, and the man got close. Then he said, "I come from your friend, Abraham Lincoln."
And he said, "Go on your way, 'cause you're free and can do as you please, now and forever and forever."
The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all slaves, however. It only applied to territories in rebellion. Ironically, the only place where slavery remained legal now was in the Union and the lands it occupied. During the federal occupation of New Orleans, all blacks, free and slave alike, were forced to carry passes when moving about the city.
We were never slaves until the Union Army came here.
But if some free people of color felt they'd been better off in the Old South, others began to look forward to the end of the war someday and the promise of a new, reconstructed Louisiana.
The New Orleans, the Union, as well as the New Orleans Tribune, were published by free blacks, and it emboldened the black community to demand political rights, social rights, economic rights.
On October 24, 1862, L'Union reported on a parade of black Native Guard soldiers at the racetrack 4 miles outside of New Orleans. The writer noted their good discipline and their skills in the use of arms. This was not news. The real story here was that these black soldiers now wore a new uniform. The Native Guard had switched their allegiance to the Union Army. General Butler had made them a persuasive offer. These Louisiana Native Guards were the first officially sanctioned African Americans to be sworn into the United States Army. Before the war's end, Louisiana would supply 24,000 black troops to the Union, more than any other state. Virtually all the black officers in the U.S. Army were Louisianians. However, they found themselves no more welcome in the Union ranks than they had been among the Confederates.
The truth is, none of our soldiers seems to like the idea of arming the Negroes. Our boys say this is a white man's war, and the Negro has no business in it.
Nevertheless, Native Guard units based at Ship Island and other locations continued to train, anxiously awaiting the day when they could prove themselves on the battlefield. They would not have long to wait. After taking New Orleans, Union troops headed upriver to Baton Rouge. Governor Moore and the state legislature fled west and moved the state capital to Opelousas, ahead of the Union invasion. Baton Rouge fell to Admiral Farragut peacefully. A few weeks into the occupation of the city, however, 40 Confederate guerrillas launched a surprise attack on a group of Union sailors as they crossed the river in a rowboat. The sailors were just looking for a place to do their laundry. Admiral Farragut did not take the matter lightly. He ordered his fleet to open fire on Baton Rouge.
It was a heart-rending scene. Women searching for their babies along the road where they had been lost. Others sitting in the dust crying and wringing their hands. For by this time, we had not an idea but what Baton Rouge was in ashes or being plundered, and we had saved nothing.
Many who evacuated Baton Rouge did not return. Those who stayed behind awoke to the thunder of artillery again on August 5th, 1862. This time, it was the Confederate Army that attacked the city. Once more, the citizenry fled amidst a murderous rain of gunfire. Major General John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, the former Vice President of the United States, led Confederate forces.
Breckinridge was going to attack the city from the east, and at the same time, a Confederate gunboat, the Arkansas, was to sail down from Vicksburg and disperse the Union fleet at Baton Rouge and bombard the Union forces from the riverside. But the Arkansas never arrived.
After making its way downriver, the warship's engines gave out 4 miles above Baton Rouge.
When the crew found that they couldn't restart the engines, they didn't want the Union fleet to capture it. So the Arkansas was set on fire and left adrift. And it exploded somewhere about where US 190 bridge is today.
The town, what there is left of it, is a deserted, desolate place. The streets are forsaken. The stores are closed. To the east of us are a large number of stacks of chimneys, which are all that is left of what 6 months ago were elegant residences.
After the Confederates withdrew, Union troops abandoned the city and returned to New Orleans, but not before looting what was left of Baton Rouge.
This place has been nearly completely sacked by the soldiery. Scarcely a single house has escaped, all the citizenry having fled. Even the officers' tents are filled with furniture from deserted houses.
I could hardly believe that Abraham Lincoln's officers had really come so low down as to steal in such a wholesale manner. Not a book remained in the parlor.
It was the policy of Butler, when he could, to leave the hard hand of war, as some historians have called it, on the people. And he thought initially that he could do this by destroying much, if not all, of Baton Rouge and making the people there feel the brunt of warfare.
Butler's troops wrecked or burned more than a third of the city's houses.
Butler just became too controversial. One of Lincoln's goals was to try to bring the southern states back into the Union as quickly as possible. But you have Butler there who has angered all the people, both loyal and rebel.
In December of 1862, Union General Nathaniel P. Banks sailed from New York with reinforcements. He arrived, unannounced, in New Orleans on a Sunday evening. General Banks had been sent to relieve the beast of his command. Fighting had spread across Louisiana like the onrush of summer brush fires. Battles were waged in the sugar-rich regions of Bayou Lafourche. Donaldsonville was bombarded and burned. General Banks led campaigns into the Bayou Teche region in the heart of Acadiana, ravaging the countryside. Blood was shed from Alexandria to the mouth of the Atchafalaya. But no matter how many battles they won, the Union still could not claim victory in Louisiana, for they still could not capture the Mississippi River.
By 1863, the Confederates only had two strongholds left on the Mississippi River, Vicksburg and Port Hudson. And as long as they could control those two spots, then they controlled the mouth of the Red River, for one. And in that corridor between Vicksburg and Port Hudson, the South was still able to shift supplies and men and mail orders. The two halves of the Confederacy were still linked as long as the South could maintain Port Hudson and Vicksburg.
Fighting raged in northeast Louisiana as the Union tried several times to open the river by taking Vicksburg, but they were driven back each time. Northern generals grew so desperate to seize the Mississippi that they even tried to change the river's course, straightening it to bypass Vicksburg altogether. Thousands of men were forced to dig miles of canals.
In doing this, they flooded northeast Louisiana. Union engineers estimated at one time that they had intentionally flooded 1,000 square miles of northeast Louisiana.
But the Mississippi stayed right where it was, firmly in Confederate hands. On May 27, 1863, General Banks ordered a full frontal assault on the rebel stronghold of Port Hudson. Among the vanguard were the 1st and 3rd Regiments of the Louisiana Native Guard, numbering more than 1,000 soldiers. 6 times they charged across open terrain through a blinding hail of enemy fire. At the front of their ranks was Captain André Caillou.
Caillou led his troops against an impregnable fortress there at Port Hudson. His name is often called up and referenced in terms of bravery of blacks, not only in the Civil War, but in other wars.
Louisiana Native Guard's assault at Port Hudson was heroic, but no more heroic than the others. The difference was it was the first time that black soldiers had been used on that scale, and it convinced Banks and began to convince other generals like Grant and Sherman that with proper training, black soldiers could be just as effective as the white soldiers.
Some called André Caillou the first black hero of the Civil War, but the battle at Port Hudson would make heroes of many men.
The heat of the day became oppressive, and it was most heartrending to hear the wounded begging to be moved into the shade, and we unable to do anything for them. Darkness finally threw a veil over the field, whereon lay hundreds of dead and dying.
Backed by Admiral Farragut's fleet of gunboats on the river, General Banks commanded a force of some 40,000 troops. The Confederates' fortress at Port Hudson was defended by less than 7,000, yet their lines held. The soldiers settled in for a long siege.
You can constantly bombard the defenders with artillery and rifle fire so that they can't rest, they can't move around during the daylight. You've got the heat, you've got insects, you've got all these factors that are just really constantly preying on the minds of these soldiers. There's no respite in siege warfare. It's constant bombardment, constant deprivation.
By the end of June, Union casualties exceeded 4,000.
Seeing the doctors with sleeves rolled up, splashed with blood, here a pile of booted legs, there a pile of arms, was more trying than the horrors of the battlefield.
The misery was so great that during lulls in fighting, the Confederate soldiers would sneak across the lines to bring canteens of water to the very men they'd been shooting.
The piteous cries of water, water from hundreds of the enemy's wounded and the groans of the dying now touched with deepest sympathy those with whom they had but today been locked in deadly strife.
Despite Union charges and relentless pounding from Farragut's ships, the men at Port Hudson held off an army 6 times its size for 48 days, the longest siege in U.S. military history. But on July 7th, word reached them that 150 miles upriver, the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg had fallen. It was senseless to continue. Nearly starved, the rebels surrendered Port Hudson 2 days later. After trying to kill each other for 6 weeks, the soldiers now came out of their trenches, laughing and weeping. Men in both blue and gray stood together on the battlefield, shook hands, and celebrated the end of the hellish siege.
There's a very human story, particularly during the siege, of the deprivation that the soldiers on both sides faced, the hardships that they had to go through, and really what it took for these men to remain loyal to the ideals that they had joined the armies to fight for, particularly the Confederate soldiers.
1 week later, the steamer Imperial sailed down the Mississippi and docked in New Orleans.
The Father of waters again flows unvexed to the sea.
Our cause is not dead, it is only sick. We are conquered but not subdued, and our independence will yet be recognized by the leading powers of the world. The Yankees are here on a visit.
Gettysburg was lost on July 3rd, Vicksburg on July 4th, Port Hudson on July 9th. The tide had turned against the South, but the Confederates clung stubbornly to their lost cause, and the war would drag on for another 2 years. With some 60% of the white males of Louisiana serving in the war, women and children were left to fend for themselves.
Annie, my dear, you will have to take the reins into your own hands. I hope by this time you have made arrangements for the coming crop. I'm very much afraid that you will not be able to make much this year. Never despair. Do your duty. With love, I remain your dearest husband until death.
As their modest farms and businesses collapsed behind them, many ordinary men in uniform began to question whose interests they were really serving.
There seems to be a very bad feeling between two classes of citizens here in Winfield. The non-slaveholding population thinks that the slaveholders are not doing their duty, and therefore should be made to do it.
Almost 3/4 of Louisiana's white families owned no slaves. They worked their small farms with their own hands.
I have been standing guard over my horse all night on account of some of our boys leaving. I feel very confident that some of them will absent themselves when an opportunity presents itself. I intend to stick to the command as long as possible.
Desertions occur daily. If captured, the deserter is treated with rigor. Military executions take place weekly, on Fridays.
Whether Union troops or Confederate, sometimes it was hard to tell who the enemy really was.
Our own troops have stripped me by robbery of nearly every resource for living from day to day.
For civilians, living conditions became so miserable that many of those who could afford it simply abandoned their homes and moved west to Texas. Others chose to stay and do what they could to help their fellow Louisianians. On January 26, 1864, Henry Watkins Allen became the second Confederate governor of Louisiana. Allen was a war hero who had lost the use of his legs in the Battle of Baton Rouge. He demonstrated that battlefields aren't the only place for gallant service.
Early last May, he had loaded 2 boats with corn, bacon, flour, and sugar destined for this parish, without solicitation. Starvation literally stared this part of our population in the face.
By now, however, neither bold initiatives nor desperate measures could change the inevitable outcome of this war. Now that the Mississippi River was in the firm grasp of the Union Army, Louisiana was virtually lost by the Confederacy. But as late as 1864, the rebels still control one of the last and now most vital waterways of the South, the Red River. Millions of dollars worth of Confederate cotton lined its banks, and the river remained an opened corridor for trade and supplies from the West. With the state capital now located in Shreveport, victory in the Red River Valley would be the last nail in Confederate Louisiana's coffin. And General Nathaniel P. Banks wanted to be the man to hammer it home. But military matters weren't the only thing on his mind.
Nathaniel Prentice Banks is a true political general in the sense of the Civil War. He was not a professional soldier. He never went to West Point. He had been a 3-term governor of Massachusetts. He had been the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, and he had a burning desire to be President of the United States.
The great textile mills in the Northeast were starved for Southern cotton, and the industry was languishing. If Banks could get his hands on all that Red River cotton, his political status would skyrocket after the war.
He's also thinking he's got to have a battlefield victory to have any chance of winning the presidency or defeating Lincoln at the Republican convention. He's got to have it. The Red River campaign is going to be the great chance, and he sees it, he can smell it, he can taste it. He knows that if he takes Shreveport, the Confederate capital, he is going to make a run for the presidency.
But Banks was better suited to political campaigns than military ones. Opposing him would be some of the finest commanding officers of the Confederacy. Major General Richard Taylor, the son of U.S. President Zachary Taylor, and the young Acadian General Alfred Mouton. In the spring of 1864, Banks's men advanced along the Red River, seizing Fort de Russy. With the support of Admiral David Porter and a formidable fleet of Union gunboats, the Army continued upriver, easily capturing Alexandria and then Natchitoches. The real prize, however, would be Shreveport.
There was an ammunition factory there that turned out 10,000 rounds of ammunition a day. There were clothing factories and shoe factories. There were medical supplies.
And just beyond Shreveport lay all of Texas, just waiting for General Banks to march in and take it. Banks commanded an army of 44,000 men. Greatly outnumbered, General Taylor and his forces retreated through the piney woods of northwest Louisiana. They destroyed everything in their path to keep it from falling into Union hands, including mountains of their own cotton.
And so all around Alexandria are like funeral pyres of cotton. Cotton burns, it burns hot, it smolders, it's hard to put out, and it burns for a long, long time, and it makes thick smoke. And Banks had to have thought that perhaps here goes some of my political aspirations up with that cotton smoke.
The loss of his precious cotton was a frustrating setback for Banks. He soon grew impatient with the progress of the entire campaign. But in his rush toward Shreveport, General Banks made a fatal mistake.
Banks's campaign began to fall apart when he got to Natchitoches. One of the things that proved to be a giant error on Banks's part was from Natchitoches there were two roads you could go to Shreveport on. One was the River Road, which you just followed the Red River, which is the road he should have taken because it would have kept him with the gunboats and he would have had the support of the Navy. The other road was a very narrow woods road that snaked through the piney woods and went through Pleasant Hill and Mansfield, and that's the road he took.
Imagine men marching in columns 20, 25 miles long, not knowing where you are, not seeing for days even houses because the trees were so dense and so thick. As one soldier put it, it looked like going through a dark green cathedral with no end.
Banks expected that the rebels would continue retreating and make their stand at Shreveport. He was wrong.
A sizable portion of Taylor's army is Louisiana troops, and they have seen their homes invaded by these Union soldiers, and they want to attack. They want the opportunity to try to throw back the invaders and force them to retreat. So they are really anxious to fight.
At 4 p.m. on April 8, 1864, the rebels turned and launched a blinding attack. With only 8,000 men, Taylor's forces charged across an open field with bayonets fixed. Leading this charge was General Alfred Mouton.
They hit one element of the Union Army, virtually destroy it. They hit a second element of the Union Army a few miles farther down the road and destroy it. And as night is finally falling, they hit a third element of the Union Army along the road. These Union forces are successful in stopping the Confederates from advancing. Night has fallen, and it's really impossible for the Confederates to continue.
The fight at Mansfield was one of the largest battles west of the Mississippi and one of the last Confederate victories. The next day, the Confederates stormed Banks's army again, this time 20 miles south at Pleasant Hill. Their attack was as ferocious as the day before.
Several Union troops write in their diaries that it was the most difficult fighting they had seen, and these are people who had been at Vicksburg. Some had been at Shiloh. A lot of people died at Pleasant Hill. A lot of people died at Mansfield. Very, very tough fighting, hand-to-hand fighting.
The Confederates chased Banks's army all the way back to Alexandria, where Admiral Porter waited with his fleet. But by this time, the level of the Red River had fallen. They were trapped above the rapids. Union Army engineer Joseph Bailey quickly devised a wing dam to raise the water level in the river. Just ahead of General Taylor's unrelenting drive, Banks's forces barely managed to escape Alexandria. They did, however, find the time to leave the town with a lasting reminder of their visit.
Men, women, and children would flee for their lives, leaving everything but their bodies to burn. There is no use trying to tell about the sights I saw and the sounds of distress I heard.
Nearly half of Alexandria was reduced to smoking ruins. Amazingly, when General Banks returned to New Orleans, he claimed victory at Mansfield. Other officers assessed the situation a little differently.
The army was shamefully beaten by the rebels.
Whatever battles the rebels may have won in Louisiana, elsewhere the war had already been lost. On April 9, 1865, a year to the day after the Battle of Pleasant Hill, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army in Virginia. Like a tumble of dominoes, the rest of the Confederate forces soon followed suit. Finally, America's most terrible war had come to an end.
It is impossible for me to describe the emotions of my heart at the sight of these parts of the country. Soon, I was in my dear wife's arms, and the happiness I enjoyed at this moment surpassed all conception.
But the short-lived joys of coming home was smothered by the devastation that had been wrought in Louisiana by war. Now there was little left to come home to. More than 600 battles and skirmishes were fought on Louisiana soil. Plantations were in ruins, industries wrecked, and families ripped apart.
I have been completely ruined. My land, the only thing remaining, is totally valueless, and every source of revenue completely dried up.
When the Civil War started in 1861, Louisiana was first in the South in per capita wealth. At the end of the war, it's last in the South in per capita wealth. Roughly 1/3 of Louisiana's economy is done away with when the slaves are freed.
Worse than the economic losses was the toll taken in human lives. The numbers stagger today's imagination.
I've done some rough statistics that indicate that if Americans today, with present-day population, suffered fatalities in proportion to that population equal to that suffered by the white South, there'd be something over 13 million. Can you imagine the feelings of Americans today at suffering fatalities like, on that scope? It's our war. It took place right here.
Not until well into the next century would the state begin to recover from the ruinous effects of those 4 years of siege, effects which still echo among us today. But even amid the ashes of war, there kindled faint new hopes for the future.
I have not yet met a man who does not acknowledge and feel that the questions of secession and slavery are finally and irretrievably settled, and the feeling for a lasting peace and union is general and genuine.
Some former enemies sought to reconcile and together reconstruct a new Louisiana. Even before the war ended, many looked to Louisiana for a model of the South's future.
The Reconstruction governments in New Orleans started as the war was still being fought. Abraham Lincoln, the president, wanted a friendly government as soon as he could.
The whole North watched very carefully what went on in Lincoln's Louisiana experiment, because the whole North was trying to figure out what to do when the war ended, and was this going to work?
Lincoln's Louisiana boasted a new and surprisingly modern constitution.
The Constitution provided for an end to slavery, and it provided for a free public school system for both black and white children.
The doors of our public schools must be opened, that our children side by side may study from the same books and learn the same great truth that God created of one blood all nations of man to dwell on the face of the earth.
After the war, the federal government established the Freedmen's Bureau to help the ranks of impoverished Southerners, both black and white, by putting men back to work at a fair wage and providing them with food.
I think that the biggest strength of the Freedmen's Bureau is that it offered hope. It gave blacks the illusion of the possibility that things would change. It said to blacks that there's a change in the whole landscape of what would be permitted.
We desire the Negro should be given something to live and hope for. He should be brought within the pale of the civil law, guaranteed all the rights of person and property.
However, most in Louisiana had fixed their gaze not on the future, but rather on old grievances and a dark, distorted vision of the past. The war may have ended, but the violence had only begun. To learn more about Louisiana's rich history, visit us online at louisianahistory.org.